Amina stood barefoot on the cracked pavement, the cold rain hammering down on her like 1,000 tiny punishments she didn't deserve. Her thin nightgown clung to her shivering body, soaked through within seconds, offering no protection against the storm or the brutal reality of what had just happened. The door behind her had slammed with such finality that it still echoed in her ears, mixing with the cruel laughter that had followed her out into the darkness. That laughter belonged to Cale, the man she had trusted with everything, the man whose child now grew inside her belly, and to Leora, the woman who had been in her home, in her bed, destroying her life from the inside out. Her hand instinctively went to her head, fingers trembling as they touched the jagged, uneven cuts where her braids used to be. Those braids had been her crown, grown carefully over years, a connection to her grandmother, who had taught her to care for them with pride. But tonight, Cale had held her down while Leora took scissors to them, hack by brutal hack, their voices filled with mockery as Amina screamed and fought and begged them to stop. The humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain. They had stripped her of her dignity, her beauty, her sense of self, and then thrown her out like garbage into the storm. The rain now washed away the loose strands that still clung to her neck and shoulders, carrying them into the gutter where Cale clearly believed she belonged. Amina's legs felt weak, barely able to hold her upright, but she forced herself to take one step, then another, moving away from the house that had become her prison. Her mind raced through the nightmare of the past months, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. Cale had been so different when they first met. He had been charming, attentive, seemingly captivated by her warmth and her family's success. He had pursued her relentlessly, making her feel special and wanted in ways she had never experienced before. Against her brother's warnings, she had fallen for him completely, married him quickly, and cut ties with the people who had tried to protect her. That had been Cale's plan all along, she realized now with sickening clarity. He had systematically isolated her from everyone who loved her. First, he had suggested that her brothers were controlling, that they didn't respect her choices or her independence. He had planted seeds of doubt about their intentions, making her question whether they truly cared about her happiness or just wanted to manage her life. Then came the arguments, carefully orchestrated moments where Cale would create conflict between Amina and her family, always positioning himself as the victim, always making her choose between him and them, and like a fool, she had chosen him every single time. Her brothers Arian, Zephyr, and Cade had built an empire from nothing, transforming their late father's struggling business into a multinational corporation worth billions. They were powerful, respected, and fiercely protective of their baby sister. But Cale had convinced Amina that their protectiveness was actually possessiveness, that their concern was actually control, that their love was actually manipulation. He had twisted everything until she couldn't see the truth anymore. One by one, she had stopped answering their calls, stopped attending family gatherings, stopped being part of the family that had always been her foundation. The pain in their eyes, when she had told them she needed space, still haunted her. But Cale had assured her it was necessary, that she needed to establish boundaries, that true love meant putting your spouse first above everyone else. Once he had successfully cut her off from her support system, Cale's true nature had emerged like rot beneath a polished surface. The tenderness disappeared, replaced by criticism and contempt. Nothing Amina did was ever good enough. Her cooking was inadequate, her appearance was embarrassing, her intelligence was questionable. Her very existence was a burden he had graciously agreed to bear. He controlled every aspect of her life, monitoring her phone, limiting her access to money, questioning her every movement outside the house. And when she had discovered she was pregnant, hoping desperately that the news might bring back some tenderness between them, Cale had looked at her with disgust and said the baby was just another chain tying him to a woman he had stopped loving months ago. Then came the final betrayal, the one that had shattered whatever fragments of hope Amina had been clinging to. Her grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, leaving Amina a substantial inheritance, a gesture of love from a woman who had helped raise her and had always believed in her potential. The money was meant to give Amina security, freedom, and options. But because she was married, because she had trustingly put Cale's name on all her accounts, because she had believed that marriage meant partnership and shared resources, Cale had simply taken it all. He had transferred every penny into accounts she couldn't access, forged her signature on documents, and stolen her grandmother's final gift to her. When she had confronted him, he had laughed in her face and told her she was too stupid to manage money anyway, that he was doing her a favor by taking control of assets she would have wasted. Tonight had been the culmination of months of abuse, the final act of cruelty in a relationship that had become a waking nightmare. Leora had been there in their home, draped across their couch like she owned the place, smirking at Amina with the confidence of a woman who had already won. Cale hadn't even pretended anymore, hadn't offered excuses or apologies. He had simply announced that Leora was moving in, that Amina needed to accept the new reality, and when Amina had tried to argue, when she had raised her voice and demanded respect in her own home, he had grabbed her. The violence had been shocking in its suddenness and its brutality. He had forced her into a chair while Leora approached with scissors, and together they had cut away her braids, while Amina sobbed and struggled uselessly against Cale's iron grip. The insults they had hurled at her during those terrible minutes still rang in her ears, each one designed to destroy whatever self-worth she had left. They had called her worthless, pathetic, ugly, stupid, unwanted. They had mocked her pregnancy, suggesting that no man would ever want a woman carrying another man's child, as if Cale hadn't been the one to create that child in the first place. They had laughed at her tears, feeding off her pain like parasites, and when they were done, when Amina's beautiful braids lay scattered across the floor like the remnants of her former life, Cale had physically lifted her and thrown her out the front door into the storm. The door had locked behind her with a decisive click, and through the window she could see Cale and Leora embracing, celebrating their victory over the woman whose life they had systematically destroyed. Now Amina stood in the rain with nothing, no money, no shelter, no dignity, and no hope. Her phone was in her hand, miraculously still in her pocket when Cale had thrown her out, but it was nearly dead, and she had nowhere to go. Cale had blocked all her contacts months ago, a violation she had only discovered tonight when she had tried to call for help. Her brother's numbers were still there, but she was certain they wouldn't answer. Cale had told her repeatedly that they had given up on her, that they were relieved to be rid of a sister who had chosen a loser over her own family, that they had written her out of their lives completely. She had no reason to doubt him, because everything else he had said about her isolation had proven true. But standing there in the storm, pregnant and broken and utterly alone, Amina realized she had nothing left to lose. Pride meant nothing anymore. Fear of rejection seemed trivial compared to the reality of her current situation. With trembling fingers, she opened her messages and found Aryan's name, her oldest brother, the one who had always been most protective of her. She typed slowly, her hands shaking so badly she had to delete and retype several times. The message was simple, just 3 words that contained all her desperation, all her regret, all her hope that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about everything. Aryan, please help. She hit send and immediately regretted it, certain that the message would go unread or unanswered, that her brothers had indeed moved on from the sister who had abandoned them. But within seconds, faster than seemed physically possible, her phone buzzed with a response. Her heart stopped as she read the words on the screen, words that didn't contain anger or rejection or the indifference she had expected. Instead, they contained something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Amina, where are you? We're coming. Send your location. Stay exactly where you are. We're coming right now. Tears flooded her eyes, mixing with the rain on her cheeks, but these tears were different from the ones she had cried earlier. These carried relief and disbelief and the overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been as alone as Cale had made her believe. Her fingers fumbled with the phone as she shared her location, and then she waited, huddled against a wall trying to protect her belly from the cold and the rain, counting the minutes and praying that this wasn't some cruel joke or misunderstanding. The sound came first, cutting through the storm like something from a movie, the heavy thrum of helicopter blades beating against the wind and rain. Amina looked up, squinting through the downpour, and saw lights descending from the dark clouds, impossibly bright and impossibly real. The helicopter landed in the street with professional precision, and the door opened before the blades had even fully stopped spinning. 3 figures emerged, moving with purpose and power, and even in the darkness and the rain, Amina recognized them instantly. Aryan, Zephyr, and Cade, her brothers, were here. They moved toward her, like avenging angels stepping out of myth and into reality, their expensive suits already soaked through, but their faces carved from stone and fury. Aryan reached her first, his hands gentle, despite the rage she could see burning in his eyes, and when he touched her face with trembling fingers, tracing the rough edges where her braids had been cut away, his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Amina, who did this to you?" She couldn't answer, couldn't form words through the sobs that had suddenly overwhelmed her, and so she simply collapsed forward into his chest, feeling his arms close around her like a fortress she had been locked out of for far too long. Zephyr and Cade flanked them immediately, one removing his jacket to wrap around her shaking shoulders, while the other spoke rapidly into his phone, coordinating things she couldn't process through the fog of shock and exhaustion. Within minutes she was inside the helicopter, the noise of the blades drowning out everything except the feeling of safety that enveloped her as her brothers surrounded her protectively. Someone had wrapped her in heated blankets, and a medic was checking her vital signs with efficient professionalism. But all Amina could focus on was the fact that they had come. After months of believing they had abandoned her, after convincing herself that she had destroyed their relationship beyond repair, they had dropped everything and come for her within minutes of her desperate message. The realization was almost too much to process, layers of Cale's lies beginning to crack and crumble as the truth of her brother's love became undeniable. The flight passed in a blur of warmth and murmured reassurances, and when they finally landed, Amina found herself being carried into a sprawling estate she vaguely recognized as Aryan's private residence, a place she hadn't been allowed to visit in over a year. The house was massive and beautiful, all warm lighting and comfortable furniture, but what struck her most was the sense of home it radiated, something she realized she hadn't felt in her own house for longer than she cared to admit. A team of people moved with quiet efficiency around her, medical professionals setting up equipment, staff preparing rooms, everyone working together with a coordination that spoke of careful planning and significant resources being mobilized entirely for her benefit. The doctor was kind, a woman in her 50s with gentle hands and a reassuring voice, who examined Amina thoroughly while explaining everything she was doing. The questions were detailed and professional, covering not just her immediate physical state, but the months of stress and inadequate care that had preceded this crisis. Amina answered as honestly as she could, though shame colored every admission about the weight she had lost, the meals she had skipped because Cale controlled the grocery money, the prenatal vitamins she couldn't afford because he had taken her bank cards. Through it all, Orion stood in the corner of the room, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping, his hands curled into fists that he periodically had to consciously relax. When the examination finally concluded, the doctor's smile was genuine and brought the first real relief Amina had felt in hours. "You and the baby are stable. You're dehydrated and malnourished, and there are signs of significant stress, but with proper care and rest, I expect both of you to be fine. We'll monitor you closely over the next few days, but you're going to be okay." The words broke something open inside Amina, releasing a flood of emotion she had been holding back through sheer force of will. She started crying again, but these tears were different, carrying release and gratitude rather than despair. Once the medical team had departed and she was settled into a guest suite that was larger and more luxurious than any space she had occupied in months, her brothers gathered around her with expressions that mixed relief with lingering fury. Amina tried to sit up straighter, tried to compose herself into something resembling dignity, and then the words started tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for being such a burden, for causing all this trouble, for making you drop everything to come rescue me, like I'm some helpless child who can't manage her own life. I know you must be so disappointed in me, and I understand if you're angry, and I promise I'll figure out how to pay you back for the doctor and everything else. I just need a little time to get back on my feet, and then I won't be your problem anymore." The silence that followed her rambling apology was deafening, and when she finally dared to look up at her brothers' faces, she was shocked to see pain rather than anger in their expressions. Zephyr moved first, sitting on the edge of her bed and taking her hand with a gentleness that made her want to cry all over again. "Amina, listen to me very carefully. You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are our sister, and we love you. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, we wouldn't do for you. The fact that you think you need to apologize for needing help tells us everything we need to know about what that bastard has been doing to you." Cade, usually the most reserved of her brothers, spoke next, his voice rough with emotion. "We never stopped trying to reach you. He blocked our numbers, returned our letters, turned us away at the door. We hired investigators to make sure you were safe because we were terrified about what might be happening. But you're an adult and you had made your choice, and we couldn't force our way into your life if you didn't want us there. But we never, not for one single day, stopped caring about you or wanting you back." Aryan moved to stand at the window, his back to the room, but his voice carried clearly. "We knew something was wrong. We knew Cale was isolating you, manipulating you. But proving it and making you see it were two different things. We've been waiting, watching, ready to move the second you reached out. And now that we have you back, I need you to understand something." He turned to face her, and the cold fury in his eyes made her shiver despite the warm room. "We are going to handle Cale. You don't need to worry about him anymore. You just focus on healing and taking care of yourself and that baby. Leave the rest to us." The certainty in his voice, the absolute confidence that justice would be served, should have frightened her, but instead, Amina felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope that the nightmare might actually end. Her brothers exchanged looks that seemed to communicate entire conversations without words, and she realized they had already been planning, already coordinating responses to a threat they had probably anticipated long before tonight. The thought that they had been prepared to help her, just waiting for her to ask, was almost overwhelming. The next morning, after the first full night's sleep Amina had experienced in weeks, she woke to find the house bustling with controlled activity. When she made her way downstairs, following the sound of voices, she discovered her brothers had converted one of the estate's large offices into what could only be described as a war room. Multiple computer screens lined one wall, displaying financial documents, legal papers, and what appeared to be surveillance footage. A team of serious-looking people in business attire worked at various stations, examining documents, making phone calls, typing rapidly on laptops. The scope of the operation was staggering, and it was all focused on one goal: unraveling every aspect of Cale's life and crimes. Aryan noticed her in the doorway and immediately came over, guiding her to a comfortable chair positioned where she could see the screens but remained separated from the intense work happening around them. "We've been busy," he said simply, and then began walking her through what they had discovered in less than 12 hours of investigation. The picture that emerged was so much worse than even Amina had realized, layers of deception and theft that went far beyond what she had known about. The forged signatures were the first revelation, dozens of documents bearing her name in handwriting that resembled hers, but contained subtle differences that experts could easily identify as fraudulent. Cale had been signing her name to contracts, transfers, and legal documents for months, creating a paper trail of consent she had never actually given. Every major financial decision that had depleted her resources and transferred her assets had been accomplished through carefully executed forgery, crimes that carried serious legal penalties. The inheritance theft was even more extensive than she had known. Her grandmother had left her $80,000, money that was supposed to be held in trust specifically for Amina's benefit. But Cale had somehow managed to gain access to those funds through a combination of forged authorizations and exploitation of their joint accounts. The money had been systematically drained over the course of several months, transferred into accounts that Cale controlled exclusively, and then distributed in ways that painted a clear picture of his priorities. Large sums had gone to Leora, funding her lifestyle and presumably buying her complicity in his schemes. Other amounts had been spent on luxury items, trips, and investments that benefited only Cale. But the discovery that made Amina's blood run cold was the life insurance policy. Cade pulled up the documents on one of the main screens, highlighting the relevant sections as he explained in a voice tight with controlled rage. He took out a policy on you 6 months ago, shortly after you discovered you were pregnant. $500,000, with himself as the sole beneficiary. Then, 2 months ago, he increased the coverage to a full $1 million. And look at the date, that's right after your grandmother passed away and the inheritance became accessible. The implications hung in the air like poison, and Amina felt her hands begin to shake as the full horror of what might have been planned became clear. Aryan moved to stand beside her, his hand on her shoulder, providing both comfort and stability. "We're handling it," he said firmly. "All of it. The forgery, the theft, the policies, everything. But there's something else you need to see." Zephyr pulled up a photograph on another screen, and Amina felt her breath catch in her throat. It was Leora, dressed elegantly and smiling at some social event, and around her neck was a strand of pearls that Amina recognized instantly. They had belonged to her grandmother, worn by her on special occasions, imbued with decades of memories and love. They had been in the jewelry box Amina kept in her bedroom, items she hadn't thought to check, because she never imagined Cale would stoop to stealing actual jewelry. But there was Leora, wearing stolen pearls at what appeared to be an expensive restaurant, flaunting the theft like a trophy. Something shifted inside Amina in that moment, the last vestiges of self-blame and shame burning away in a fire of righteous anger. She had been willing to forgive Cale's cruelty to herself, had made excuses for his behavior, had internalized his criticisms, and convinced herself she deserved his contempt. But seeing her grandmother's pearls around another woman's neck, seeing this tangible symbol of love and legacy stolen and worn with such casual disregard, crystallized everything into sharp focus. This wasn't about her failures or inadequacies. This was about a predator who had targeted her deliberately, stolen from her systematically, and endangered her and her child calculatedly. And she was done being a victim. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. Her brothers looked at her with expressions that mixed surprise and approval, recognizing the shift in her demeanor. "We've already started," Aryan replied, and the smile that crossed his face was not pleasant. "Watch." Across the city, in the apartment that Cale had once shared with Amina before forcing her out, chaos was beginning to unfold. Cale woke late, his head pounding from too much celebration the night before. Leora sprawled beside him in the bed he had denied to his pregnant wife. His phone was buzzing insistently, multiple notifications demanding his attention, and when he finally picked it up, confusion gave way to alarm and then panic. His bank accounts were frozen, every single one showing zero available balance with notices about pending investigations. The clients he had been working with, relationships he had spent months cultivating, had sent cancellation emails overnight, terminating contracts without explanation. His credit cards were declined. His professional reputation, carefully constructed through networking and manipulation, was crumbling as messages flooded in from colleagues distancing themselves from him. Everything he had built on the foundation of Amina's stolen resources was collapsing simultaneously. Leora woke to his shouting, her own panic rising as she checked her accounts and discovered that her access to funds had also been cut off. The money Cale had been giving her, the lifestyle she had been enjoying, had evaporated overnight. She turned on him immediately, her voice shrill with accusation. "What did you do? You said you had everything under control. You said her family didn't care what happened to her. You said we were safe." Cale tried to call his bank, his lawyer, his business contacts, but every avenue led to dead ends or ominous warnings about ongoing investigations. And then his phone buzzed one more time, a message from an unknown number that contained no identifying information but carried a threat that was absolutely clear. "You should have chosen differently." The words were simple, but the implications were terrifying. Someone knew what he had done, someone with the power to dismantle his life with surgical precision, and they were just getting started. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of healing that felt both impossibly slow and surprisingly swift. Amina spent her mornings in sessions with Dr. Helena Moss, a therapist who specialized in trauma and manipulation, someone her brothers had carefully vetted and brought to the estate specifically for her. At first, Amina had resisted the idea of therapy, convinced that talking about her problems was just another form of burdening people with her weakness, but Dr. Moss had a way of gently dismantling the defensive walls Amina had built around herself, brick by painful brick. In their third session, Dr. Moss had asked a question that seemed simple on the surface, but cut straight to the heart of everything Amina had been avoiding. When did you start believing that needing help made you weak? The question had hung in the air between them, and Amina had found herself unable to answer immediately, tracing back through memories and conversations, until she realized with stunning clarity that this belief hadn't always been part of her. It had been carefully planted and cultivated by Cale, reinforced through countless small moments, where he had mocked her for asking questions, criticized her for expressing uncertainty, and praised her only when she silently accepted whatever he decided. The therapy sessions became archaeological expeditions into her own psyche, unearthing the systematic ways Cale had reshaped her understanding of herself and her worth. Dr. Moss explained the concept of isolation as a control tactic, how abusers deliberately separate their victims from support networks not out of love or desire for closeness, but because isolated people are easier to manipulate and control. Every fight Cale had orchestrated with her family, every guilt trip about choosing him over them, every suggestion that her brother's concern was actually interference, had been calculated moves in a strategy designed to leave her vulnerable and dependent. Understanding the mechanics of what had been done to her was both liberating and enraging. Amina found herself experiencing emotions she had suppressed for months, anger and grief and betrayal, all demanding to be felt and processed. Some days she cried for hours, mourning the time she had lost and the version of herself who had been systematically dismantled. Other days she felt a fury so intense it frightened her, a desire for retribution that seemed at odds with the gentle person she had always believed herself to be. Dr. Moss assured her that all of it was normal, that healing wasn't a linear process of feeling progressively better, but rather a complicated journey through every emotion she had been denied the right to feel. The afternoons became Amina's favorite time, hours she spent in the estate's sprawling gardens, where spring was beginning to assert itself with determined beauty. The gardens were meticulously maintained, but felt wild and free, full of hidden corners and unexpected delights. She found herself drawn to a particular bench beneath an old oak tree, a spot where the afternoon sun filtered through new leaves and created patterns of light and shadow that shifted with every breeze. It was there, surrounded by the stubborn optimism of growing things, that Amina began to sketch. At first, the sketches were nothing more than idle doodling, ways to occupy her hands while her mind processed the revelations emerging from therapy. But gradually patterns began to emerge on the pages, ideas that surprised her with their clarity and ambition. She had always loved fashion, had spent her teenage years designing clothes in notebooks and dreaming about creating pieces that made people feel beautiful and confident. Cale had mocked those dreams relentlessly, calling them childish fantasies that proved she wasn't serious or practical, and eventually she had stopped sketching altogether, packing away her notebooks and convincing herself that he was right about her lack of talent or vision. But now, with distance from his constant criticism and the space to rediscover her own voice, the designs came flowing back with an urgency that felt like reclaiming stolen parts of herself. She sketched maternity wear that was both elegant and comfortable, having experienced firsthand the way pregnancy could make you feel invisible or reduced to just your changing body. She designed professional clothing with hidden accommodations for nursing mothers, pieces that would allow women to maintain their careers without sacrificing their ability to care for their children. Every design carried intention and understanding, born from her own experiences of feeling unseen and unsupported. Zephyr discovered her sketching one afternoon, approaching quietly so as not to startle her, and when he looked over her shoulder at the pages spread across her lap, his low whistle of appreciation made her blush with pleased embarrassment. "Amina, these are incredible. Have you thought about actually doing something with these designs?" She had started to deflect, old habits of minimizing her abilities rising automatically, But then she stopped herself and considered the question seriously. Why shouldn't she do something with them? What was actually stopping her beyond internalized messages from a man who had proven himself to be a liar about everything else? That evening, she had shown her designs to all three brothers, nervousness making her hands shake slightly as she spread the sketches across the dining room table. Their reactions had been immediately and genuinely enthusiastic, but more importantly, they had treated her ideas as serious business propositions rather than cute hobbies. Ariane had started asking questions about her target market and production timelines. Cade had pulled out his tablet to research similar companies and identify gaps in the market. Zephyr had already been mentally calculating startup costs and funding strategies. Within an hour, what had started as private sketches had transformed into the skeleton of an actual business plan, and Amina felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year: excitement about her own future. The confidence that began growing in those garden afternoons started spreading into other areas of her life. She spoke up more in family discussions, offering opinions without immediately second-guessing herself. She made decisions about her own care and schedule without seeking permission or approval. She started physical therapy to rebuild strength she had lost during months of stress and inadequate nutrition. Small acts of autonomy that most people took for granted felt revolutionary to Amina, each one a declaration that she was reclaiming ownership of her own life. While Amina was rebuilding herself in the sanctuary of the estate, Cale's life was experiencing a very different kind of transformation. The brothers had been methodical in their approach, understanding that true justice required not just financial consequences, but complete social and legal destruction. They had compiled evidence of every crime, every fraud, every theft, and then they had strategically released that information through channels that would cause maximum damage. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, and within hours Cale's name was trending on social media for all the worst reasons. A respected financial journalist had published a detailed exposé outlining the systematic fraud Cale had committed against his wife, complete with documentation of forged signatures, stolen inheritance, and manipulated accounts. The article carefully avoided any details that might compromise the criminal investigation, but it provided more than enough information for the court of public opinion to render its verdict. Business partners who had worked with Cale scrambled to distance themselves, issuing statements about how shocked and disappointed they were, how they had no knowledge of his personal crimes, how they were immediately severing all professional relationships. The networking groups he had been part of quietly removed his name from their membership lists. The gym where he worked out revoked his membership. Even the coffee shop he frequented as his regular workplace posted a notice that he was no longer welcome on the premises. Every space he had occupied was systematically closed to him as people rushed to avoid association with his tainted reputation. Leora, watching her comfortable life disintegrate and facing potential charges as an accessory to Cale's crimes, decided that self-preservation required throwing him completely under the bus. She reached out to a local television station and gave a tearful interview where she painted herself as another victim of Cale's manipulations, claiming she had no idea about the extent of his crimes, insisting she had believed him when he said his marriage was already over and that Amina had been the one to leave. The performance was unconvincing to anyone who looked closely, but it served her purpose of attempting to separate herself from Cale's sinking ship. In the interview, Leora returned the pearl necklace with great ceremony, claiming she had only just discovered it was stolen and was horrified to have unknowingly worn something taken from Cale's wife. The transparent attempt at damage control fooled no one, but the image of her handing over the pearls became the defining visual of the scandal, shared and commented on across social media with a mixture of mockery and disgust. People who had never met Amina found themselves invested in her story, cheering for her recovery and demanding justice for the systematic abuse she had endured. The legal consequences moved with surprising speed once the evidence was compiled and presented. Federal agents arrived at Cale's apartment on a Thursday afternoon, their presence drawing curious neighbors and opportunistic photographers who had been tipped off about the timing. The charges read like a catalogue of betrayal, identity theft, fraud, forgery, embezzlement. and a litany of financial crimes that carried significant prison time. Cale was led out in handcuffs, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief, clearly unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so completely. The footage of his arrest was broadcast on evening news programs and shared endlessly online, becoming a moment of cultural conversation about financial abuse, manipulation within marriages, and the vulnerability of victims who trust the wrong people. Legal experts were brought on news programs to discuss the case, praising the thoroughness of the evidence and predicting that Cale faced substantial prison time if convicted. Advocacy organizations used the case as an example of why financial literacy and independence were crucial, why isolation was a red flag, why community support mattered. Watching the news coverage from the estate, surrounded by her brothers, Amina felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing Cale face consequences for his actions, validation in having the truth of what she had experienced acknowledged publicly, but there was also an unexpected sadness for the person she had been who had loved him and believed in their future together. That version of herself felt like a stranger now, naive and trusting in ways that were simultaneously admirable and painful to remember. As the legal proceedings progressed, and it became clear that Cale would be convicted on multiple charges, the brothers began discussing what additional measures they wanted to pursue. They talked about civil suits to recover not just the stolen inheritance, but punitive damages for the harm he had caused. They discussed using their influence to ensure he served maximum sentences with no possibility of early release. They strategized about ways to make sure his name remained permanently associated with his crimes, that no amount of time or rehabilitation would ever allow him to escape the consequences of what he had done. Amina listened to these discussions with growing discomfort, and finally, during a family meeting 2 months after her rescue, she interrupted with words that brought the entire conversation to a stunned halt. "I forgive him." The silence that followed was profound, her 3 brothers staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to concern, clearly wondering if the trauma had somehow damaged her ability to recognize the enormity of what Cale had done. She held up a hand before they could start arguing, her voice steady and clear. "Let me finish. I forgive him, not for his sake, but for mine. I've learned in therapy that holding on to rage and hatred doesn't hurt him. It only hurts me. He's already stolen enough from me, and I refuse to give him any more of my mental and emotional energy. Forgiveness doesn't mean what he did was acceptable, and it doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. It just means I'm choosing not to let him continue poisoning my life from prison." Aryan opened his mouth to respond, but Amina wasn't finished, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts she had been processing for weeks. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, and it absolutely doesn't mean mercy. I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I want every single charge to result in maximum sentencing. I want the civil suit to proceed and for him to be held financially accountable for every penny he stole plus damages. I'm filing for divorce immediately, and I want full custody of this baby with termination of his parental rights so he can never use our child as a way to maintain contact with me or control any aspect of my life." She paused, looking at each of her brothers in turn, making sure they understood the distinction she was drawing. "I also want financial restitution that ensures I'm compensated for what was taken, and I want it structured so that he's paying it back for the rest of his life if necessary. But I don't want revenge beyond legal justice. I don't want to spend years obsessing over making him suffer or ensuring he never recovers. I want to take back what he stole, protect myself and my child, and then move forward with building a life that has nothing to do with him." The contrast between her emotional forgiveness and her unwavering commitment to legal justice created a framework that her brothers slowly began to understand and respect. This wasn't weakness or naivety. It was a kind of strength that refused to be defined by victimhood or consumed by vengeance. Amina was choosing to reclaim her power, not through endless retaliation, but through establishing firm boundaries, demanding accountability, and then moving forward with her life. Zephyr spoke first, his voice thoughtful. "So you're saying we pursue every legal avenue, we ensure he faces full consequences for every crime, we protect you and the baby completely, But we don't engage in the kind of extra-legal harassment or revenge that would keep you emotionally entangled with him. Amina nodded, grateful that he understood. Exactly. The legal system can handle punishing him. I need to handle healing from him. Those are two separate processes. Cade leaned back in his chair, a smile slowly spreading across his face. You know what? That's actually more devastating than anything we were planning. Cale wanted to be important enough to you that you'd spend years hating him, giving him space in your thoughts. You're essentially saying he's not worth that emotional energy, that he's just a criminal who needs to be processed through the justice system and then forgotten. That's ice-cold, little sister. Aryan was quiet for a long moment, studying Amina with an expression that mixed pride with lingering protectiveness, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both acceptance and admiration. You've grown stronger through this than I think any of us fully appreciated. If this is how you want to handle it, then we support you completely. We'll make sure the legal consequences are thorough and severe, we'll protect you and your child absolutely, and then we'll help you build whatever future you want without looking back. The conversation that followed was practical and focused, stripped of the vengeful energy that had characterized earlier discussions. They outlined the legal strategy, confirmed the divorce proceedings, discussed custody arrangements and parental rights termination. They reviewed the restitution demands and made sure everything was documented and legally sound. And through it all, Amina participated as an equal voice in decisions about her own life, no longer the victim being rescued, but an active agent in her own recovery and future. When the meeting finally concluded, and her brothers dispersed to handle various aspects of the plan, Amina returned to her favorite spot in the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful for the heaviness of the day's discussions. She placed her hand on her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had recently started, her baby making its presence known. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to the child growing inside her, a promise and a declaration. "Your father made terrible choices that hurt a lot of people, but that's his story, not ours. Our story is about healing and building and becoming strong. I'm going to make sure you grow up knowing you're loved, that you're wanted, that you're safe, and I'm going to make sure you never have to carry the weight of someone else's shame or crimes." The future stretched ahead, uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. There would be challenges, moments of difficulty, times when the trauma resurfaced and required renewed processing. But Amina was no longer the isolated, frightened woman who had stood barefoot in the rain, believing herself alone and worthless. She had her family back, she had her strength returning, she had a business to build, and a child to raise and a life to reclaim. And most importantly, she had learned the difference between forgiveness and boundaries, between moving forward and forgetting, between justice and revenge. Cale would face the consequences of his actions through the legal system, but he would no longer have any power over her emotional landscape or her future choices. That victory, Amina realized, was the most important one of all. The house was smaller than the estate, more modest in its elegance, but it was entirely Amina's, purchased with money from the restitution settlement and chosen because it felt like a fresh start rather than a continuation of anyone else's story. It sat on a quiet street lined with old trees, their branches creating a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow. The neighborhood was filled with families, the sounds of children playing and neighbors greeting each other over fences, a sense of community that Amina had missed desperately during her isolation. Moving day had been chaotic in the best possible way, her brothers arriving with a moving truck they had packed themselves, refusing to hire professionals because they wanted to be part of establishing her new life. Watching Aryan, Zephyr, and Cade carry boxes and furniture into her home, arguing good-naturedly about the best placement for the couch and whether the kitchen table should face the window or the doorway, Amina had felt something shift inside her chest, a lightness that took her a moment to identify as simple happiness. The nursery had been the last room they tackled, and Amina stood in the doorway watching her intimidating, powerful brothers transform into something softer as they assembled the crib that would hold baby Zara. The name had been chosen carefully, meaning blooming flower in Arabic, a symbol of new life emerging from difficult soil. Arian read the instructions with intense concentration, determined to follow every step precisely, while Zephyr and Cade sorted through bags of tiny clothes and blankets, holding up onesies with expressions of wonder at how something so small could be meant for an actual human being. "Does this look level to you?" Arian asked, stepping back from the crib and tilting his head critically. Zephyr pulled out his phone and used a level app, because of course he had a level app, and after careful consultation, they adjusted the crib by millimeters until everyone was satisfied. Cade had taken on the task of organizing the changing table, methodically arranging diapers, wipes, and creams, with the same attention to detail he brought to corporate acquisitions, creating a system that was probably far too elaborate for the chaos of actual infant care, but touched Amina with its earnest preparation. When the nursery was finally complete, they all stood together in the small room, taking in the pale yellow walls that Amina had painted herself, the white furniture that gleamed in the afternoon light, the mobile hanging above the crib with its soft fabric clouds and stars. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, and the whole room felt infused with hope and possibility. This was where her daughter would sleep, where Amina would rock her during late-night feedings, where the first words would be spoken and the first steps would be celebrated. This room represented a future that Cale had tried to destroy, but had ultimately failed to prevent. Amina felt tears gathering in her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of pain or grief. These were tears of gratitude and relief, the emotional release of having survived something that had nearly broken her and emerging on the other side into sunlight and safety. Zephyr noticed first, immediately moving to her side with concern, but she waved him off with a watery laugh. "I'm fine, I'm good. These are happy tears, I promise. I'm just so grateful for all of this. For all of you, for the fact that we're standing here right now preparing for Zara, instead of the alternative that almost happened." Her brothers surrounded her in a group embrace, careful of her pregnant belly, and for several minutes they just stood together in the nursery, a family reunited and reinforced by everything they had survived. When they finally pulled apart, Amina's smile was genuine and unguarded, the kind of expression that came from deep contentment rather than social obligation. It was the first time in over a year that she had smiled without any shadow of fear or anxiety behind it, and the transformation was visible in every aspect of her appearance. The hollowness had left her cheeks, the constant tension had released from her shoulders, the defeated slump had been replaced by confident posture. She looked, her brothers thought with relief and pride, like herself again. That evening, after her brothers had left and Amina was alone in her new home, she walked through each room slowly, trailing her fingers along walls and furniture, claiming the space as her own. The kitchen where she would cook meals according to her own preferences and schedule. The living room where she would relax without fear of criticism or sudden violence. The bedroom where she would sleep peacefully without anxiety about what mood her partner might be in. Every space represented autonomy reclaimed and safety established. This was her sanctuary, and no one would ever make her feel unsafe in her own home again. The weeks that followed were filled with the mundane magic of building a life on her own terms. Amina decorated according to her own taste, choosing colors and furniture that made her happy rather than seeking anyone else's approval. She established routines that suited her rhythm rather than accommodating someone else's demands. She reconnected with old friends she had been isolated from, rebuilding relationships that Cale had systematically destroyed. And as her due date approached, she found herself genuinely excited rather than terrified, ready to meet the daughter who had survived so much already before even being born. But alongside the personal healing and preparation for motherhood, something else was growing in Amina's mind, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her individual recovery. The therapy sessions with Dr. Moss had given her language and understanding for what she had experienced, frameworks for recognizing manipulation and abuse that she wished she had known earlier. And as her story had become public through the legal proceedings, she had received messages from dozens of women who saw their own experiences reflected in hers, who were trapped in similar situations or had escaped, but were struggling with the aftermath. One message in particular had stayed with Amina, haunting her thoughts and demanding response. A woman named Sarah had written about being systematically financially abused by her husband, all her accounts emptied and her credit destroyed, but feeling unable to leave because she had no resources and nowhere to go. The desperation in Sarah's words, the shame and self-blame that permeated every sentence, had felt like reading her own story from months earlier. Amina had responded immediately, connecting Sarah with resources and offering support, but the interaction had crystallized a realization that had been building for weeks. She wasn't the only one. Her experience, while uniquely painful in its details, was part of a much larger pattern of financial abuse that trapped countless women in dangerous situations. And while there were resources for victims of physical domestic violence, support for those experiencing financial abuse was far more limited and harder to access. Women often didn't even recognize what was happening to them as abuse, having internalized the belief that their partners had the right to control household finances, or that struggling with money management was a personal failing rather than a deliberate tactic of control. The idea for the Reclaim Foundation emerged gradually from these realizations, taking shape through conversations with Dr. Moss, her brothers, and the growing network of women who had reached out to share their stories. Amina envisioned an organization that would provide comprehensive support for victims of financial abuse, addressing both the immediate practical needs and the longer-term psychological recovery. She wanted to create the resources she wished had existed when she was trapped, the knowledge and support that might have helped her recognize the danger sooner and escape more quickly. 3 months after Zara's birth, after Amina had adjusted to the overwhelming reality of new motherhood and regained some semblance of routine, she officially launched the Reclaim Foundation. The offices were modest, located in a renovated building downtown that had been chosen specifically for its accessibility and welcoming atmosphere. The space was designed to feel safe and comfortable rather than institutional, with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and private consultation rooms where women could discuss their situations without fear of being overheard or judged. The foundation offered multiple levels of support, recognizing that women at different stages of recognizing and escaping financial abuse needed different resources. There were educational workshops on financial literacy and recognizing signs of economic control, free sessions that were open to anyone and designed to empower women with knowledge and skills. There were confidential consultations with financial advisors who specialized in helping clients untangle complicated situations involving joint accounts, forged documents, and stolen assets. There were connections to legal services for women who needed representation but couldn't afford traditional attorney fees. And perhaps most importantly, there was a support group where women could share their experiences and realize they weren't alone in what they had endured. Amina made herself available as both an organizer and a participant, sharing her own story openly and creating space for others to do the same. The first time she spoke publicly about her experience, addressing a room full of women who had come to the foundation seeking help or information, she had been terrified that she would break down or fail to articulate the complexity of what she had survived. But once she started talking, the words flowed with surprising ease, her voice steady as she described the systematic isolation, the financial manipulation, the psychological abuse that had nearly destroyed her sense of self-worth. She talked about the shame she had felt, the belief that she was somehow responsible for not recognizing the red flags sooner or protecting herself better. She described the difficulty of leaving, even when she knew intellectually that the relationship was dangerous, the way abuse warped your perception until you couldn't trust your own judgment anymore. She spoke about the terror of having nothing and nowhere to go, the vulnerability of being pregnant and homeless, the desperation that had driven her to reach out to the family she thought had abandoned her. And she talked about the other side of survival, the slow and non-linear process of healing, the gradual rebuilding of confidence and autonomy, the discovery that she was stronger than the abuse had convinced her she was. The response to her speech was overwhelming. Women approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking her for putting words to experiences they had struggled to articulate even to themselves. Some shared their own stories, variations on the same themes of manipulation and control, each one unique in its details, but familiar in its patterns. Others asked for advice on how to start the process of leaving or how to rebuild after escape. Several mentioned that hearing Amina's story had been the first time they had recognized their own situations as abuse rather than personal failure, that the framework she provided had given them clarity they desperately needed. One woman named Maria, who had attended the first support group meeting with visible reluctance and suspicion, approached Amina several weeks later with an update that made everything feel worthwhile. Maria had been trapped in a marriage where her husband controlled every dollar, giving her a small weekly allowance for groceries and demanding receipts for every purchase. She had no access to their joint accounts, no credit cards in her own name, no ability to save money or make financial decisions independently. The foundation had connected her with a legal advocate who helped her understand her rights and options, and with a financial advisor who helped her open a secret account and start saving small amounts whenever possible. Maria had managed to leave, taking her 2 children and moving in with a sister she had been estranged from because her husband had orchestrated conflicts with her family. She was now working part-time and slowly rebuilding her financial independence, still facing significant challenges, but no longer trapped in a situation where someone else controlled every aspect of her economic existence. "You saved my life," Maria told Amina simply, and the weight of those words, the responsibility and the privilege of being able to help, settled over Amina like a mantle she was determined to wear with honor. The foundation grew rapidly, word spreading through social services networks and community organizations about the unique resources it offered. Amina hired staff members who brought their own expertise and experiences, building a team that could provide comprehensive support. She established partnerships with local businesses willing to offer jobs to women rebuilding their lives, creating pathways to economic independence that went beyond just escaping abuse. She worked with legislators to advocate for stronger laws around financial abuse and identity theft, using her own story as a case study for why existing protections were inadequate. 6 months after the foundation's launch, Amina was invited to speak at a national conference on domestic violence, addressing an audience of advocates, social workers, lawyers, and policymakers. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces representing the broader movement to support survivors, she felt the full weight of how far she had come from the woman who had stood barefoot in the rain, believing herself worthless and alone. That broken version of herself felt like a different person now, someone she could look back on with compassion rather than shame, someone whose suffering had not been meaningless because it had been transformed into purpose. Her speech at the conference was passionate and well received, but it was the conversation afterward that stayed with her most powerfully. A young woman approached her, maybe 22 or 23, and said quietly, "My boyfriend has started doing some of the things you described, checking my phone, asking where every dollar goes, getting angry when I want to see my friends. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I was overreacting, but hearing you talk about how these patterns escalate, I realized I need to get out now before it gets worse. You probably just saved me years of suffering by helping me recognize this early." That moment crystallized for Amina the true value of what the foundation was doing. It wasn't just about helping women escape abuse, though that was critically important. It was also about education and prevention, about giving people the knowledge and frameworks to recognize dangerous patterns before they became entrenched. Every woman who heard her story and recognized similar warning signs in her own relationship, every person who learned to value their financial autonomy and refused to surrender it, every family member who could identify concerning behaviors in their loved one's partner, all of it contributed to a culture shift that could protect countless people from ever experiencing what Amina had endured. The foundation became her life's work, the way she transformed her suffering into something that served others. She balanced this purpose with motherhood, bringing Zara to the office sometimes and modeling for her daughter what it looked like to be a woman who built things and helped people, and refused to be defined by the worst thing that had happened to her. And on the days when the work felt overwhelming, when hearing story after story of abuse threatened to re-traumatize her or make her lose faith in humanity, Amina would look at Zara's face and remember why this mattered. Her daughter would grow up in a world where her mother was known not as a victim, but as a survivor who built something meaningful from her pain. Zara would learn from earliest memory that strength meant asking for help when you needed it, that vulnerability could coexist with power, that the measure of a person wasn't whether they fell, but whether they got back up and helped others rise too. And perhaps most importantly, Zara would grow up surrounded by women who were reclaiming their lives and their power, who served as living proof that no situation was truly hopeless and no person was irredeemable beyond their capacity to heal and grow. The Foundation's impact rippled outward in ways Amina couldn't always track or measure. Women who had received support returned later to volunteer or donate once they were stable. Some went on to establish similar resources in their own communities, spreading the model to places where such services didn't exist. Others simply rebuilt their lives quietly, raising children in safe homes and modeling healthy relationships, breaking cycles of abuse that might otherwise have continued for generations. Each story was its own small miracle, its own testament to resilience and the possibility of transformation. On the Foundation's one-year anniversary, Amina stood in the office surrounded by staff, volunteers, and the dozens of women whose lives had been touched by its work. Someone had brought a cake decorated with the Foundation's logo, a phoenix rising from flames, a symbol they had chosen together as representing the rebirth that came after surviving destruction. As they cut the cake and celebrated, Amina looked around at the community that had formed from shared pain and collective healing, and she felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes for what felt like the 1,000th time since her rescue. She thought about the woman she had been, standing in the rain with nothing, and the woman she had become, standing in a room full of purpose surrounded by people she had helped and who had helped her in return. The journey between those two versions of herself had been excruciating, marked by trauma and grief and hard-won healing. But it had also been transformative in ways she couldn't have imagined when she was in the depths of her suffering. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, built a legacy that would outlast her, and found meaning in the worst experience of her life by ensuring it served a purpose beyond just her individual pain. As the celebration continued around her, Amina slipped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of that evening in the garden when she had first promised her unborn daughter that they would be okay. That promise had been kept, exceeded even in ways that the desperate woman making it couldn't have predicted. They weren't just okay, they were thriving, building, creating, contributing to something larger than themselves. Cale was serving a 12-year sentence in federal prison, a fact that sometimes still felt surreal to contemplate. The legal system had worked, slowly but effectively, holding him accountable for his crimes and protecting other potential victims from his manipulations. Amina rarely thought about him anymore, her emotional energy redirected toward more productive purposes, but when she did, she felt only a distant kind of pity for someone whose choices had led to such complete destruction of his own life. The forgiveness she had chosen still held, not because he deserved it, but because she refused to carry the weight of hatred alongside everything else she was building. Her phone buzzed with a text from Arian, a photo of Zara from earlier that day when he had taken her to the park while Amina was working. Her daughter was laughing, arms outstretched toward a bubble floating just beyond her reach, her face full of joy and wonder at the simple magic of afternoon sunshine and iridescent spheres dancing on the breeze. That image, Amina thought, was what everything had been for, creating a world where her daughter could reach for bubbles without fear, could laugh without anxiety, could grow up knowing she was loved and safe and supported, no matter what challenges life brought. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities that had seemed impossible during the darkest moments of her abuse. The Foundation would continue growing, helping more women, and advocating for systemic changes. Zara would grow surrounded by love and examples of strength. Amina herself would keep healing, keep building, keep transforming her pain into purpose. And somewhere, other women trapped in situations like hers would hear her story and find in it the courage or knowledge they needed to save themselves. As Amina headed back inside to rejoin the celebration, she carried with her the certainty that every difficult step of her journey had been worth it, that surviving had meant more than just continuing to exist, but had opened pathways to thriving in ways that honored both her suffering and her strength. The woman who had been thrown out into the storm had not just survived, she had been reborn into someone who now helped others find their way out of their own storms and into sunlight. And that transformation, from victim to survivor to advocate, was a legacy that would ripple forward through countless lives, proving that even the worst circumstances could become the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful, if met with courage and determination to ensure that suffering served a purpose beyond just pain.